Hey, it's The Real Brian, and you are listening to The 360 Entrepreneur with Jan Ilunga.
This is episode 154, and today we talk about podcast sponsorships explained. Here we go.
Welcome to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast, the show for entrepreneurs and small business owners who dream big and want to do bigger. Join some of the world's top entrepreneurs, internet marketers, and best-selling authors as they share their inspiring stories, their struggles, and give actionable tips that will help you build, grow, and promote your online business. Here's your host, Yanni Lunga.
Hey there, how's it going? I hope you're having a fantastic week and you're ready for this new episode of the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. And in this one, we're going to take our magnifying glass and look at podcast sponsorships. Now, I'm pretty sure that when you think about podcast sponsorships, you think about the typical sponsorships you may have heard on podcasts. Not on this one, but on other podcasts. So you may have heard and you're like, okay, so what is called the CPM sponsorship model. However, podcast sponsorship isn't all about those traditional sponsorships. There are different things you can do to really hack sponsorships for your podcast. And that's the topic of today's episode. We're joined by my podcasting brother. He's a podcaster, a media personality, a speaker. He's the real Brian. And I'm really excited about bringing you this interview. The show notes for today are over at yanilunga.com/episode 154. Okay, here is podcast sponsorships explained with the real Brian. Hey everybody, today we are joined by somebody who is really an incredible podcaster, and you're going to understand more about why I say that in a second. As I said, he's a podcaster, he's a producer, he's the passionate host of ProfitCast, a show about taking the journey on creating a profitable and successful podcast. When he's not busy with ProfitCast, he's also doing other things. He can be heard, for example, on the Podcaster's Paradise podcast alongside John Lee Dumas, and he's here with us. I'm so pumped to welcome on the show, not any Brian, but the real Brian. Hey, Brian, how's it going?
Well, thank you, Jan. It's great to be here, man. Doing well. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I have to say, the real Jan is doing well too.
Yes, I love it.
All right. Brian, thank you so much for joining us. And first and foremost, I want to personally thank you for what you do for the podcasting community. I love it. You're really super passionate about podcasting, but you're also really passionate about helping others with your show. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And you are welcome. And I'm just glad to be doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. And we were chatting before recording, and we were saying about how nice it is to be busy doing what one loves, which is important. And when one talks about something you love, I know that ProfitCast has to be right there at the top. So I'm curious, and I'm sure some people are joining you and I, Brian, and they have no idea what we're talking about. They don't know what ProfitCast is. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into podcasting and what the listeners who are here with you and I can expect from tuning into ProfitCast?
Yeah, I started behind the microphone, about 20 years ago now. And it started off as originally a dream to get into radio. I wanted to be a radio DJ, and I wanted to play music for people. I wanted to be popular, all that good stuff, right? So I tried to get into it, and I think it was back in, I don't know, I want to say middle school, right around middle schoolish. I started to have this idea to get into radio, and I was listening to old recordings of Wolfman Jack and Orson Welles from way back. I mean, that was 1930s recordings, when he did War of the Worlds and The Shadow and that kind of thing, which became my favorite superhero, by the way. Hence my superhero name on Aero Squad. I go by The Shadow. So anyway, I did that. I did that for a while. I started to mess around with, microphone and mock radio stations, we'll call it that, in my bedroom when I was a kid. And then in high school, I had a chance to shadow a DJ at a radio station, get some experience, and then start an actual high school radio station. And then, kind of from there, I was in radio. I did college radio, and then I got on to actual radio stations. The sad part, though, was as I was finally getting into the world of radio was starting its decline. And it was kind of a heartbreaking thing because I wanted to be a morning show host and I wanted to get out and have the freedom to do what I, knew was best for the listeners.
Mm-hmm.
And I was entering into a world of radio where they would tell you what to say. You only had 15 seconds to talk or 5 seconds for example. I mean, it just really depended, but they really controlled your creative ability.
Right.
It pretty much took away the creative ability, I guess is the best way to put it. And so, radio wasn't as fun as I thought it was going to be just because, you just kind of felt like a robot. And then radio started getting to this whole idea of hiring certain people in one state and then voice tracking, which was basically record your shows in advance and then play them on a computer. All they would syndicate them at that point.
All right.
And so they would get rid of local DJs and start firing. They didn't need them anymore. Save money. So that was kind of the sad part of radio. And I started to realize that there was really no future for me in radio. And then I heard about this whole thing called internet radio. And I thought, ooh, I can get into internet radio because it's the next new thing. And everybody was so excited about it. And I got out there and I started an internet radio station and it was awesome and it was successful. And then I did a morning show and then internet radio within 3 years was obsolete.
Right.
3 years. And I'm going, oh, well, now what? And so that's when I just started to learn about podcasting. Podcasting had been around for a few years prior, and I had heard about it. I didn't really know much about it, but at the time I thought, well, let's try to transition my morning show into a podcast. Let's figure out how to do that. And that's kind of how I got into podcasting. And once I transitioned over to that, I thought, well, you know what? The nice thing about podcasting is I have full creative control. I can do the morning show style. I can talk about whatever I want.
All right.
And the beauty of it is that, there's no politics and there's nobody governing what I need to do. Which is great.
Right.
Really, only who's governing it is the listener, and that's great. That's what we want. So
yeah,
that's how I got into it, and then it kind of leads up into the story of ProfitCast, which I can tell you about if you want.
Yeah, sure. And before you do that, Brian, I want to say, I think it was just meant to be. It means that you had to, step away from those things to actually become a podcaster. And I like the fact that you really said that, one can talk about whatever one wants. And I think you and I have really seen this. We are both part of Podcasters Paradise, and there are really podcasts about things that sometimes I come across podcasts that I'm like, I had no idea that somebody would be talking about this kind of topic. Yeah. So that's what's great about podcasting. So podcasts, and you told us your show, or one of the shows you host, let's say your main show is ProfitCast. So I think the title of the podcast has already some hints with the word profit. So what is ProfitCast about, and how can the listeners, what can the listeners get from tuning in episode after episode?
The original idea behind it was somebody asking me, well, I got this question asked a lot, was what's your passion? Because I wanted to go into podcasting. I wanted to create a podcast that could make money. And answering that question for me is very hard because I have a lot of passions. Right. And, I'm not one of those guys who picks one thing and dives in and doesn't do anything else. Kind of like with music. I'm all over the place. So,
love it.
And I know I have to pick something, but, I could easily say, in 1 minute, I'm going to game. The next minute, I'm going to go bike or play basketball. It just doesn't matter. So anyway, it's kind of a fun thing. But when I started to figure out, okay, what's the passion? I came to the conclusion that the passion for me was just getting behind the microphone. And I could talk about 20 different things and I would be happy as long as I was behind the mic and I was doing what I loved from that standpoint. So then the idea for ProfitCast came, okay, well, the question that kept coming back to my mind was, it doesn't matter what my topic is. I mean, it does, right? But regardless of the topic, how am I going to make money doing this in a way that I can pay my bills, make a full-time living so that I can do this full-time instead of just as a side hobby?
Right.
And which, that's spawned forth tons of questions. And I went out looking for those questions. And when I was starting ProfitCast, there wasn't a lot of information out there about how to really make money. I mean, people touched on it, but they didn't really give a lot of information. It was pretty basic. So I said, you know what? I'm going to start this journey. I don't know the answer, but I'm just going to start this podcast and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say, hey, join me on this journey to find out what it takes to really profit with a podcast. And that included making money. That included growing your audience and also creating a nice, tight knit audience, like a loyal audience. But it also meant profiting beyond the money. Although I didn't really realize that in the beginning. At first, it was just about how do I make money? Because that's what we all want to know.
Yeah.
And so I said, join me on this journey. We're going to figure this out. I'm going to interview people who have made money and have succeeded very well with podcasting. And we're going to find out what they've done. And I'm going to pass on the information and go from there. And the journey kind of has since morphed into this idea of now profiting beyond the money. So yes, the money is important. Yes, we have bills to pay, and we should not be ashamed to say that we need to make money with our podcast. At the same time, though, how are we going to do something that's far greater than the money? Impact somebody, change the world, create a movement, whatever it's going to be, whatever that is, your mission in life. And so that's kind of where this whole idea started. And that's what you can expect from the show is tips on how to really, truly profit with a podcast, whether it's making money, growing your audience, profiting beyond the money, but, understanding what it takes. And I go into a lot of mindset too.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a tendency to say, okay, well, what are the 5 steps to make money, or how do I go out and get a sponsor? But I'll actually talk about, are you ready for a sponsor?
Yeah, exactly.
And I use the musician example of that. There are musicians that are good enough for a coffee shop atmosphere, and there are musicians that are good enough for a full-on stadium or to play at the Super Bowl.
Amen.
Which one are you?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And how can you get to that point?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're so right. And thank you for taking us behind the scenes of ProfitCast a little bit. And I love that you mentioned mindset, because I think that really having the right mindset is so important. And that's something I talked about in one of the past episodes. And of course, guys, like every episode, you find the links to ProfitCast and everything else Brian and I touch on in the show notes. In that episode, I believe I was talking about, well, obviously was related to podcasting, but then I said that, if you're asking yourself the question, should I start a podcast? My answer is yes, if you're in for the long run. If you have the mindset that, that it's really a marathon, it's not a sprint. And I want to ask you, Brian, one question related to what podcasting can do for example, for some of the entrepreneurs or small business owners who are here with you and I, because you told us about your story. So you have always been really passionate about audio, about radio, about being behind the mic. So also you have been relatively comfortable because you come from a radio background, then internet radio, and then podcast. But for the people who are here with you and I, who maybe aren't necessarily so, let's say, audio savvy like you are, or radio savvy, what advice do you have for them? Why do you think, if maybe they're asking themselves, okay, new year, I want to start a podcast, I hear about podcasts, but what can a podcast do for my brand and my business? So what would you tell them?
So you're saying somebody wanting to start a podcast that is just kind of looking at what's it going to do for me, and then how do I approach it? Is that kind of what you're...
Yeah. I mean, especially for kind of the reasons why do you think is good for starting a podcast? I mean, if for people who aren't so like passionate like you are of just being basically behind the mic.
Yeah. That's a great question. And I think, the answer to that is that a podcast is very beneficial for a lot of reasons. I think about I look at it from a couple of ways, but one way that I was thinking about even recently, and I'm glad we've had this interview today though, because it's something I've been thinking about, is this idea of getting behind the microphone allows you to have influence. And I think especially for any kind of an entrepreneurial brand, having influence is essential to the success of your business. Right. Obviously, you get to choose how you wield that influence, if it's for good or bad.
Good point, Brian.
Yeah. But it really is important, because the amount of influence that you have really is determined on basically what you do. And so having a podcast, putting a literal voice to your business, and being able to connect with your community person, whether that's a listener to your show, whether that's a client, a customer, whatever, depends on whatever your business is, but being able to connect with that person in a very, quote, intimate way really does allow you to have an amazing amount of influence, whether you're trying to get them to buy your product or your service, or whether you're just trying to help them and encourage them. Whatever you're doing, it doesn't really matter. But I think that level of influence is a huge thing that I've been thinking about recently. But yeah, also going back, that it does give your business a voice, which in my opinion gives it a human personality in a way, because I think a lot of businesses tend to be very, they're inanimate, right? They're kind of a cold business. You've got a product. It's what it is. It's nice. It solves a problem. But when you can give your business a personality, and a podcast is a really great way to do that, that really does connect with your community very well. So I think it's a great way to get out there. It's another wonderful way to bring people into the world of your business in a way that they would not have found you otherwise. I've said this with blogging. If you have a blog, there are a lot of people who don't like to read or don't have time to read, but they do have time to listen to you on their commute, for example, or they're working out or whatever. So putting a voice to your blog, doing an audio blog is a really good idea too. So just anything you can do to get out there and put some kind of a personality and a personal touch and voice to your business is huge. And you may be going, well, I don't like to talk.
Right.
And then find somebody to do it for you. But one way or the other, I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. And I like, again, Brian, because you address the question from these different perspectives. And I love the fact that you talked about the influence. And sometimes what is so cool about podcasting is that since it's open, it's international, sometimes you may have influence or you may have a community in a place that is on the other side of the world. That's so crazy. And it's so great when I'm sure, Brian, you get this too. You get emails from listeners from, I don't know, Asia or Australia. I mean, in my case that I'm in Europe, can be also somebody from the States, people who are thousands of miles or kilometers away. Yeah. And they're like, oh, thank you for your show. And that really makes us feel great. But also, as you said, it helps you really build or let's say humanize the experience people have with you because they can hear your voice. And then you said it is also, if we think about it in more practical terms, it's easier. Audio, it's easier to consume than text or even video, because video is great in terms of people can also see you. So not only they can hear your voice, but they can also see you. The problem is in terms of consumption, you can't really watch a video or read a blog post if you're out for a walk. I mean, you could try, but it may be tricky, or if you're at the gym. Whereas with a podcast or a radio show, an audio blog, the only thing people need to access the content is an internet connection, obviously, and a pair of headphones, and they're good to go. I love it. So you have heard from the real Brian some of the things that podcast can do for your brand and business. So if you have been thinking about that, this is probably a good episode for you and a good push in the right direction. And I know that when we talk about profiting in podcasting, people always, or I would say maybe one of the things that often comes to mind first are podcast sponsorships. And there is a guide from John Lee Dumas that is very, very thorough. And I know that you, Brian, know John very, very well. I wanted to ask you, because I know that this is also something you talk about, if you could explain to all the people who are here with you and I, how the podcast sponsorship, let's call it standard model, works. So if they have a show, they're thinking, okay, I would like to have a podcast. How does the sponsorship model work?
Yeah, the model that I know John talks about, and I know the model that's standard is based on the CPM, which is the basically a cost per 1,000 listeners. And I personally don't agree with that model because it's an antiquated model. It's a radio model. If you have a lot of listeners, if you have thousands to tens of thousands or more per episode, by the way, and people look at, I've got 10,000 monthly downloads. No, we're talking about per episode.
Right.
If you have 10,000 listeners per episode, actual unique listeners, that's great. Most podcasts will never have that. In fact, I believe it's in the neighborhood of about 1% of podcasts in the world have that many listeners. The average number of listeners to a podcast is 165 listeners per episode. Right. So the CPM model really only works for the wildly successful podcasts, which is why I don't agree with it. And it's based on the idea that if you're to go to them and say, okay, I've got 1,000 listeners per episode, then they're going to give you $25 for a 30-second spot on your show. Which is kind of ridiculous. If you got 1,000 listeners, you deserve a lot more than $25. And the reason why it's based on this is simply because in the radio world, they can't gauge specific amounts of listeners like we can. Even though, our statistics are still limited, but we know how many people listen to an episode based on download numbers. With radio, it is a theoretical approach. So the idea is that in a geographical region, in a city, we have a tower that has the potential to reach 600,000 people. And if we look at our demographic, let's just say men aged 18 to 35, well, now we have 300,000 people that are in that demographic that live in this geographical region. Mm-hmm. So our listenership could be 300,000 listeners.
Right.
But the reality is not all of those men aged 18 to 35 are going to listen to your radio station. It's just not going to happen.
Right.
So, but they don't tell you that. They'll tell you that, it's 300,000 listeners. And then what they'll do is they'll say, but if you look at the actual numbers, if you could, the reality would be is that, maybe only 100,000 of those men listen to your show. But then think about how many people are actually going to listen at that time on that day that spot airs.
Exactly.
It's a radio station. People listen an average of 15 minutes per day if you listen to radio at all. And it doesn't say when you listen. So your ad might actually only reach a couple hundred people from that 300,000 number that they were given. Mm-hmm. And so with podcasting, the beauty of podcasting is that if you have 1,000 downloads per episode, then that means that 1,000 people listened to at least part of your episode. And chances are almost all of those 1,000 people heard that ad. Right. And so you can say, I have true 1,000 listeners versus 300,000 theoretical. And so when you look at the CPM model and say, well, that's worth $25, not really. The idea is that it's actually worth a lot more because you have guaranteed. And so I look at it as that the way to do a sponsorship is to look at it from a value-based standpoint. Mm-hmm. I know I get kind of fired up about this, but
no, but it's good. And I have to say, I actually agree with you.
Yeah. And I think it's important because value-based is the way to go, in my opinion. So instead of looking at a CPM model, say, hey, you know what? I have 300 listeners. I have 500 listeners. I have 50 listeners, whatever. And I actually was interviewing a guy on ProfitCast recently. His name's Glenn the Geek, and he talks about horses.
Right, yeah. I know the episode. Yeah.
Great guy.
The sponsorship for like small shows or something like that was the title, right?
It's basically just to get started. However you can get started with sponsorship on your podcast. But he talks about horses, and you might think, really? Like horses? It's a huge community. He's doing very well. But he was even saying, if you're a brand new podcast, why not go to a sponsor and say, sponsor me for $25 or $50 per episode? Just, that's it. It's a value-based pricing. Doesn't matter how many listeners you have. Just start somewhere. Mm-hmm. And, I know that some shows can get in the neighborhood of $200 to $300 per episode of sponsorship, even only having a few hundred listeners or maybe a couple thousand because of the value of their show and the relevance that, their topic has with the business that's going to become a sponsor and vice versa. So, I really love the idea of value pricing. And then as you grow your numbers, then you can start working on something that's a little bit higher. My theory is if you have anywhere near 5,000 listeners, or in a case of my friend who does one of the number one Walking Dead podcasts, he has 25,000 listeners an episode.
Wow.
I told him that he should be making a minimum of 5 figures a month in sponsorships alone. Minimum.
Right.
Because he has so much influence with that. And so, looking at it from that way, I think sponsorships it's a really great way to go. And if you have a small podcast or a brand new podcast, go ask someone, a mom and pop, type of business for $25 to $50 per episode. Put them on a 3 to 6 month contract because they're really not going to know for at least 3 to 6 months if their sponsorship's paying off.
Yeah, exactly.
And go for it. Just go for it. See what happens. You never know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's really also about being creative. And I think that there are in the industry, there are at least some companies that have started to take the steps toward kind of quote unquote better sponsorship model. I don't know. Brian, are you familiar with, I think they're called Pod Wallet. Are you familiar with them?
No. Are you thinking of Nerd Wallet?
No. There is a site, Pod Wallet. I don't remember if they are from Australia. Or I have to double check it. I haven't looked too much into them, but basically they have a kind of. Are you familiar with midroll.com?
Mm-hmm, I am.
Okay, so it's basically a midroll kind of. So for you guys who maybe may not know what midroll is a platform where you as a podcaster can sign up and they fund you advertisers or sponsors. The thing is that they have pretty high requirements. I mean, I remember I got rejected from them when I tried to reach out. They were like, no, sorry. Like the numbers I had, I don't even remember. They were like ridiculous in terms compared to what they're accustomed to. But basically, PodWallet does similar to Midroll, but for smaller audiences. So I think it's a kind of more, let's call it demographic approach. So I'll double check, but I think it's podwallet.com, and it's something you may even be interested in for your show at some point.
Yeah, well, I'll say something on that really quick too. Is something to keep in mind, because I do know people who are with Midroll, and Midroll, obviously, because they're doing the work behind it, takes a generous cut, which makes sense. I mean, I would expect them to,
Yeah, exactly.
And so really, if you're just wanting to host your show and not worry about all the work that goes into sponsorships, then yes, a company like Midroll or PodWallet would be perfect. But if you don't want a company like that taking a big cut, then do it yourself.
Yeah.
So that's just my thought.
Yeah,
exactly. Those are based on CPM too, though, right?
I believe so. I'm not entirely sure how their like rates are, but because I don't think there is so much information on. I think one has to sign up first or contact them or something like that. But it's definitely something to look into, especially if you are starting out or you have a small audience. But I agree with you, Brian. The best way to go about it is just make your own path. So just try to reach out to businesses, services, coaches, bloggers, whoever is in your niche. And like Brian said, just get started, put them on a contract for a few months and test things out. See, maybe it can be a great collaboration and take it from there. And another thing that I think it's important when talking about podcasts, monetization, making profit, being successful, is to really this thing that we've just talked about the creativity, about finding, let's call them non-traditional ways also to leverage your community. And one of those platforms, and we were talking about this before we hit record, is Patreon. So Brian, I know you're on Patreon, and can you tell the listeners a little bit more about Patreon and how you see it for podcasters like you and us, but even for maybe there can be some creative professionals who are joining us. So what do you like about, first of all, what Patreon is about, and what do you like about it?
I love Patreon. I think they are it's a great way to crowdfund for your podcast. So, the older way to do things was to get donations, which I know was also limited to nonprofits. And there's been a lot of new laws passed with the idea that you can crowdfund as a for-profit business, which is essentially the same thing as donations. It's just a different term.
Exactly.
But basically, Patreon allows you to, create something through a reputable business. I mean, obviously, Patreon's going to take a cut, but as a donor, basically, or as a listener, you know that when you give money to something, it's going through a reputable business. You know that the money is going to be distributed correctly, and that this business or podcast that's using Patreon has to have some sort of credibility, or else you wouldn't be allowed on Patreon. So I think it's a really, really good thing from that standpoint. But it really does allow listeners and supporters to come in and say, I'm willing to give you even as low as $1 a month, which for most people is nothing. In fact, I'm surprised more people don't give $1 a month, actually.
Yeah, you think about it, a cup of coffee is already more than $1. So
oh, yeah. I mean, most people, in fact, as we do this recording, I just got a notification that, Starbucks is changing their whole reward system. And I don't like it. In fact, I think it's a very greedy move on Starbucks' part. But what their research showed is that people on average spend more than $5 each time they come into Starbucks. And they said that the overwhelming majority will spend somewhere between $5 and $10 per visit to Starbucks per person. And I thought, oh my gosh,
that's a lot.
That's a lot of money for a coffee, and I don't know. I mean, I love my coffee, as you know, I roast my own and everything, but that's insane. And I know the markup that these guys are getting because I've done a lot of research in the world of coffee. Let me just tell you right now, it does not cost even $1 to make a cup of coffee at all. Not even close. We're talking cents here. So it's funny though that, anyway, it's what it is. But I kind of buy it. To me, it's a greedy move, but it does show that people are willing to spend a lot of money on things that are just not needed or necessary. And so, if a dollar an episode, $1 a month, right?
Mhm.
That's all it is. $1 a month. That's $12 a year. Yeah, I think people can give a lot more than that. So the cool part about Patreon, though, is that it allows people to give, like I said, as little as $1 a month, or as much as you want. So you can actually set different levels of giving. You could say, it's $1, or here's $5, here's $10, $20, $100, $500, whatever. And this is on a per month basis. You can actually also set it up as a per episode basis, which is very cool if you do a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And they have basically two sections where you have the rewards section, which I don't recommend focusing on. It's nice. The idea behind rewards is that your listener gets something tangible from their gift. So, if it's $1 a month, thank you. Great, right? If it's $10 a month, maybe you'll mention them on your podcast. If it's $100 a month, you're giving them free copies of your ebook, or I don't know. I mean, it depends on what you want to do. But the theory behind the rewards is that chances are your listener is going to support you one way or the other. And so the reward is nice, but it's not the reason necessarily that they're giving.
Right. Yeah.
So make the rewards worthwhile, but also don't worry about them being don't worry about putting focus on them. And then another piece of advice on the rewards is don't offer a lot of physical rewards. Because if you're saying, give me $20 a month and I'm going to send you a free t-shirt or a free book, then you got to factor in the cost of the t-shirt, the cost of the book, and the cost of the shipping. And by the time you're done, it may be a wash. You may not actually even get anything back from that.
Yeah.
So, e-resources are great. Ebooks, audio recordings, shout outs, whatever, it depends on what you want to do. But the other side of the milestones, and I think that's really where things can get powerful, is by setting certain goals and milestones for if you reach, let's say, $500 a month in Patreon support, you'll do this. Or if you reach 1,000 a month, you'll do this. You'll add another episode. You'll add another show, something like that. A milestone that's very realistic and something that highly benefits the actual listener or the person giving. Don't say that, hey, I can pay for my equipment, because people don't care. So the reality is they're going to say, what's in it for me? So do something that benefits them. But I think Patreon really is a fantastic way to get something up there, ask people for support to keep the show going. I mean, even if it's just to cover the cost of your podcasting on a monthly basis, it's a really, really great way just to get something going, and it gives people a way to be involved too.
Yeah, no, you're so right. And I think so some of your listeners may be, listening to you all the time. They are thinking of ways they can give back. So if you provide them with those kind of opportunities, they may be more than welcome to help you out, whether if it's just with $1, $5, 50, whatever. And so Brian, you told us, for example, you are on Patreon. So if that's okay with you, I'll include the link to your Patreon page also here in the show notes, so that people, first of all, can see it as an example, and also they can definitely help you out, become part of your community, support you and ProfitCast and everything you do in the podcasting world, because I really believe the podcasting community, Brian, really need people like the real Brian.
Well, thank you.
No, you're so welcome. I think you can tell I'm having a great time. I think it's a very interesting topic here. And there is another thing that I've actually written down here that you talked about recently on your show at the time of
Before we do that, though, do you mind if I give out an episode link because I did an interview with a guy who makes, or at the time he made about $1,200 an episode, which was about what, $5,000 to $6,000 a month.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it's ProfitCast. It's episode 36, so it's profitcastuniverse.com/36, and that entire episode is an interview with a guy who, like I said, makes $1,200 an episode through Patreon, and he gives basically all of the tricks and tips and stuff that he's done with his show to earn that kind of money. So just
that's
another
great
resource.
Thank you. So that's the perfect continuation for the next step for this interview. And again, guys, you find it there, profitcastuniverse.com for the 36, or also in the show notes. Once again, links to that episode, ProfitCast, everything else we are talking about in the show notes. And also, if you're having a good time here with Brian and I, you want to give him a shout out. Make sure to do it. You can find him on Twitter at I am the real Brian. Of course, that has to be the Twitter handle. And you can also find the show on Twitter. So if you want to keep yourself updated, not only by subscribing, obviously, to the show, but you can also follow it on Twitter at ProfitCast. And I was saying, Brian, that in one of your recent episodes, you talked about the formula for profit. Now, I think that often when people hear formula, especially in this kind of space we are in, it always sounds a bit like, yeah, right. But I really liked, though, your approach to the formula for profit, because it also had to do with something you told us early on, which is mindset. So could you kind of break that down for us? And what are the things we should keep in mind if we want to profit from our podcast?
Sure. Yeah. And you're right. It really is much more of a, it is a mindset, but it's also a strategy too. So it's not, I will say this about this formula, because you're right about that. I always get a little bit concerned about, the formula, here it goes again. It's not a magic pill. It's not a quick fix. It's not a quick success either. I mean, this is going to take time. And so this formula is something that I believe is a process. It's something you got to put a lot of time and effort into, but it's well worth it if you're willing to do it. So there are 6 things that I think, and it's funny, I could be wrong about this, because for me, it's obvious. It's always a journey. It's an experiment. This is just stuff that I learn along the way, as I observe people, as I read, as I experiment myself. But I discovered that these 6 things seem to be consistent among every single successful podcaster that I've interviewed and that I've observed and watched. And that is, number 1 is that everybody talks about the whole solve a pain or a problem, right? You hear that all the time.
Yeah.
But what I have seen is that those that just solve a pain or a problem that they don't have a personal connection to, like I go out there and I survey people and I say, what pain or problem do you have? Okay, I'm going to solve that. They might do well. But the people that I see that do extremely well are those that have a personal connection to that pain or problem, i.e., I have a pain and a problem that I need solving right now, and I don't know how to solve it. And I'm going to find a way to solve it because I'm driven to do that. And then basically what that does is that goes into number 2, which is it's that pain and problem that we have that personal connection to, but we can also solve. We have the knowledge and the ability to solve it, or we at least have the drive and the passion to go out there and find the knowledge and the information so that we can solve it. Which goes into number 3, and this one's very important, is you have a passion for that topic. I know a lot of us, probably every one of us. I don't know. I've never met anyone on this earth who has not gone through a pain or a problem in their life. You know what I mean? So every one of us has dealt with a pain or a problem that we've wanted a solution to. But there are pains and problems in our life that we're glad to have a solution to, and we're glad to move on from. And we don't want to talk about it, and we don't want to build a podcast or a business around it. And that's okay. So make sure that you have a passion for whatever that topic is, because there's a lot of people out there who can say, oh, well, there's a pain or a problem that I could solve. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to solve it, but I could care less about this topic. Yeah. I'm just doing it because it makes me money. That doesn't work. So that's number 3, is that whole passion. Like you actually want to find the solution and you want to help others. Number 4 is that your target person that you're trying to solve this problem for wants the solution and actually knows that they need it. This is huge. This is one that I've learned the hard way. I have figured out so many times I've gone out and I said, oh man, this group of people needs this solution. And while I may be right, the reality is that either they don't want that solution, or they don't want to admit that they do, or they don't know that they need it.
Right.
And it's amazing because, like, for example, I'm a huge believer in community. And I mean, obviously, as a man, I can say that the men that I know desperately want community, but they don't want to admit that they want community because, man, we're men.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm good. I don't need
Tough
anyone.
Guys.
Tough guy. I'm good. But, man, you get deep down, every single man I know wants community, period.
Yeah.
They won't admit it. So if I were to go out and say, man, I'm going to help you solve community, they're going to be like, I'm good. I got it. Not a good business idea, right? So even though you need it. Another example is that I talk about performance a lot on ProfitCast, that, if you're going to get, if you're going to have listeners want to listen to you, you've got to work on your performance. You've got to work on your interview skills, your storytelling, the whole presentation behind the microphone, because it is a performance. Yeah. Even if it's teaching, it's still a performance. And if you're really bad behind the mic and you're hard to listen to, you're probably not going to get a lot of listeners. And so I keep talking about, like, you gotta work on this stuff. It takes time. I sucked when I started. It's cool. Take your time, but work on it. And I found that a lot of people didn't want that. And I was very surprised by that I said, hey, I'm going to help you work on your performance. And they said, I'm good. I don't need it. I went, whoa. But hey, they're not willing. So, which goes into my fifth point here, is that target person that you're solving the problem for also needs to be willing and able to pay for that solution.
Mm-hmm.
You can volunteer your life away by helping people and solving problems, but if they're not willing to pay you for that, or they're not able to pay you for it, then you don't have a business.
Exactly.
So that's a huge one. And then the last thing is able to differentiate yourself with that solution, dominate your niche. You don't have to be the first per se, but you need to be different enough that you stand out, that people actually will. Well, I've said this on a couple of episodes recently, is it's not who you know, it's who knows you. And so you need to stand out enough that people get to know who you are. They come to you because you're different. They like you. There's something about you that they want to be around. And there's something about your solution that's different. So, and that's a tough one to answer because everybody's going to differentiate themselves in a different way. And I know that's a very broad approach, but it's a very important thing. Too many people try to be like others, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So there you go. Those are the 6 things to the formula.
I love it. And really, this formula really focuses on different aspects. So you heard it, and Brian told us it's not a quick fix. It's not something kind of get rich quick kind of thing. No, it isn't. And it requires work. It requires research. And sometimes you're gonna encounter some bumps down the road. Like Brian told us, I mean, you thought that, this thing would have been perfect, but then people didn't want it, or they didn't know they wanted it. So that's very important that you give yourself room also to experiment. So this also ties into what we were talking about earlier when we talked about the sponsorship model, which is, be creative, think outside the box, and really just experiment, keep track of things, and then tweak where necessary. And Brian, we have covered quite some ground. You've been simply incredible here with us. You told us how you kind of ended up into podcasting. You told us about your show, ProfitCast. You explained to us the podcast sponsorship model, what you like about it, what you don't like about it. You told us about Patreon. We talked now about the formula for profit. I mentioned your Twitter at I am the real Brian, and the one for the show at ProfitCast. If people would like to connect with you, give you a shout out, or maybe they have a quick question, what is the quickest way to do that? Is it Twitter, or is it your email? Which one is it?
Either way is fine. Twitter's fine. ProfitCastUniverse.com has everything. It has my Twitter account. It has my email. Everything's all on that. So either way is fine.
Perfect. And also, if you have enjoyed this conversation with Brian, if you already know you're gonna subscribe to ProfitCast, make sure to go to ProfitCastUniverse.com and make sure to join Brian's email list so that you also will get access to 7 secrets of highly profitable podcasters. The real Brian, thank you so much for being here with us. And again, really, thank you for doing what you do. You are a podcasting rockstar, my friend.
Oh, Jan, thank you very much, man. I appreciate it. And it was I had a great time, great conversation. Thank you so much for having me on.
All right, we are back. Brian, what can I say? Thank you so much. Really, I ran out of great things to say about you because you're simply rock. Thank you so much, brother, for being here and sharing your expertise and provide us with more clarity on the concept of podcast sponsorships, also beyond the traditional CPM model. And you heard it. The show notes for today are over at janilunga.com/episode 154. So there you find the Podcaster's Paradise podcast, ProfitCast, and a couple of ProfitCast episodes we touched on. Last week, I said I hinted on something that I was gonna share with you. So you're actually the first to hear about this. It's so exciting. I haven't shared this with the world yet. So you're the very first person to hear about this. I'm working on a virtual summit for podcasters. What a virtual summit is a digital conference. So I'm going to be able to share more details very, very soon. It's gonna be big, it's gonna be epic. At the moment, I have about 25 confirmed speakers. So it's gonna be pretty big, and it's gonna be something that you can attend right from your home or your office. So you won't have to fly anywhere. You won't have to worry about finding other accommodation, queuing for tickets. Absolutely not. Everything is gonna take place online. It's gonna be called Podcast Success Summit. So that's the name of the event. And as the logistics of the summit grow, as more details are available, I'll make sure to share them with you here on the podcast so that you're the first to know. Another way to learn more about that is to subscribe for the newsletter. So if you have been with me before but you haven't signed up for the newsletter yet, make sure to do that right now so that you don't miss a beat on all the things I'm working on, number one, and number two, you're gonna get exclusive tips you won't find anywhere else. So make sure to go to the show notes for this episode, yanilunga.com/episode 154, and then hit the subscribe button and sign up for my newsletter. This is it for this week. Thank you for joining my podcasting brother, The Real Brian, and I here on the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. And I'm looking forward to bringing you another exciting episode next week. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the 360 Entrepreneur Podcast. For more tips and tools, head over to www.yanilunga.com.